For those of you who have been to a Riverbend field trip in the spring, you have probably experienced our meadow, and it is a magical place. There is certainly more to meet the eye. When you first look at the meadow, sometimes you just see some really tall grasses, and then when we get closer, we see this entire world happening before our eyes that we wouldn't see if we were just walking by. We really like to get into the meadow. Now, I can't be at Riverbend's meadow today, so I found my own little meadow here that we're going to explore as a habitat and learn all about. Before we get started, I want you to think about that word meadow. Have you heard that word before? What do you think of when you think of a meadow? And pull out your science journals, because remember, we're scientists during this series. And I want you to write about what you think a meadow is like. What types of animals do we find in a meadow? What type of ecosystem is a meadow? Take a minute, press pause, write a bit about a meadow, and then get back to me. So today, as I said, we're going to be scientists. So does everybody have their scientist tools? We have our eyes, our ears, our sense of touch, smell. Not going to do our sense of taste, of course. We're going to explore what a meadow is. So what is a meadow? A meadow is very simply a wide open space or field with lots of species of grass and wildflowers, especially in Pennsylvania. Do you notice anything interesting that is missing from this meadow? If you said trees, you would be right. So trees are a really thick, woody species of living thing, of plant, and we don't see trees in the wide open meadow. In fact, meadows are a type of grassland, and in other big grasslands, like say, for example, the savannas of Africa, you have big mammals that will actually knock down trees. So they help to protect the grasslands by making sure trees don't intrude into those ecosystems. Now, we don't have elephants here in Pennsylvania, but we do have really healthy meadows, which help us with lots of things. One of the things to note is pollinators. So you see behind me, we see a lot of yellow coming up right now, but as the season goes on, we're going to see so much more color, and that will attract pollinators like bees and butterflies and all kinds of really cool critters to see. So as we learn more about habitats, we know that all habitats have living things and non-living things in them. So first I want to ask you, are you a living thing? Think about that for a second. Are you living or non-living? What does it mean to be living? How do you know that you are a living thing? Name me some of the things that make you alive. So very simply, living things need to eat to consume energy. They need water, and they grow over time, and they reproduce. So think about some things that we can see in a habitat. So for example, let's think back to our stream study we did last week. Let's take a look at our stream. I want you to look at this picture and tell me, what do you see here that is living or non-living? Let's think about the rocks first. So rocks, do they eat? Don't think so. Do they grow bigger over time? I don't think so. And do they reproduce? Not unless you break them apart into tiny little pieces. They don't. So I would say rocks are probably not living things. But in this meadow here, things like grasses, they get bigger over time. They use the sunlight to consume energy. They will die and they'll decompose. And then the seeds or spores or bulbs, depending on the type of plant, will produce new plants. So they will reproduce. So I would say grass is definitely living. Rocks are not living. So we also need to talk about things that were once living. So something like a leaf that we find on the ground. People ask me, well, is that alive or is it non-living? It's not alive right now, but it was once part of a living thing. So we categorize that into a living thing. So we're going to go back to all the way back to the beginning when we first did our habitat video, and we brought out our hand lens. So if you have a hand lens at home, these are great for exploring the meadow. If you have a toy in your brother or sister's toy box that looks something like this, that'll work. In my garage, I have a big one of these that is shaped in the shape of a flower, so that would even work as well. The other thing, if you have one, a hula hoop, we don't have a hula hoop today, so we're just gonna kind of wing it, and we're gonna take a look at some of the biodiversity that we see in this meadow. We're going to use our skills of observation to pick out 2 spots to explore in the meadow. Now, we're going to be using something called a hula hoop if we were at Riverbend. I don't have a hula hoop today, so we're just going to be eyeballing it. Scientists use something called a transect, which is basically a square that they'll put in a habitat, they'll put down, and they'll count the number and identify the different species of plants that they find. And it's a way that they measure biodiversity. So we can measure biodiversity in the same way that scientists do. Now, remember, the best way to explore nature is to get all the way down to the ground. So check this little guy out here. I see this plant and I notice that it's got some green and some red underneath. It looks like the stems are actually red. So that's one plant. Then I see this big guy here. It looks like he's got a nice big thick root. I also noticed that from afar, this looks like a carpet of green, but when I get up close, I actually see a lot of space in between the plants and a lot of the soil showing. I also see a lot of dead plants that are underneath. It looks like these brown pieces here are like old pieces of grass that were from last year that maybe are decomposing there. I see sort of a species of grass that you might find in your backyard. I also see this little guy here. I see these in my backyard too. I notice it's a beautiful color, purple. And then if I look up, I see these big, huge stems. These are really kind of thick and woody species. They're really strong. I don't see any foliage on them yet, but just these big red stems. And I also see all of these beautiful yellow flowers. We'll have to identify those when we get back as well. And then one last thing I wanted to point out to you is this guy here. This is another plant, and it looks like the stem is kind of an olive greenish color. I don't see any prickers on it, although I have seen other plants that have prickers on it that look similar to this as we've been walking around. So I think I identified just there at least 5 or 6 different species. I'm going to journal all about these. I'm going to list the different types of plants that I saw. I've got some good pictures, and we're going to move on to the next site. So when we're exploring nature, we often see wildlife, but more often we find signs of wildlife. So I'm going to use this as our next location to study some biodiversity, but before we do that, I want to show you this really cool thing that I found. I have to be careful not to get too close, but it looks like a burrow. Wow, that goes really far down. And I can see where something is using this hole as a pathway underground. They must be living down there. I can see that it looks like they've kind of gotten themselves in there and they're kicking up all of this soil is all up here at the top. So it looks like it was dug maybe rather quickly. And then the other thing I noticed is these smaller little tiny holes. And I wonder if the same animal had something to do with those, although I don't see the dirt kicked up like I do in the bigger hole. So maybe can anyone try to think about what kind of animal, guess what kind of animal you think that might be? Tell me what you think. We can examine these holes a little bit more closely. They look like they go really deep down. Here's a shot from the other side. Cool. Now, speaking of biodiversity, we'll kind of zoom in on this spot here. Now, what I notice is I don't want to stay too long because actually I'm afraid that whoever lives down there is going to come up and say hello. And I noticed this other type of plant that I didn't see before. It has these green leaves, but it also has stickers. See those little stickers right there? Stickers are a great line of defense for plants. It's nature's way, plants' way of keeping predators away, things that might eat them, eat their leaves and things like that. To help us think about how each part of the meadow contributes to the habitat, we are going to compare the meadow to a diner. Think about your experiences in going to a diner or a restaurant, someplace where you go to sit down and eat a meal with your friends and family. What jobs have you seen people doing in a diner? I think about our servers who are delivering food to the customers, our chefs and our cooks who are in the kitchen making food, and the bussers who are cleaning up after our meal is finished. For the purposes of this activity, we're going to be thinking about our meadow as a diner. We have identified grass, soil, butterflies, bees, grasshoppers or crickets, worms, millipedes, slugs, spiders, and caterpillars as all being part of a meadow. Some of these things that we find in a meadow are living and some are non-living. Remember, our definition of living is that you're eating, you're growing, you're breathing air, and you're reproducing. So in our meadow diner, we have identified that our butterflies and bees represent servers in a diner. They're delivering food and pollen around the meadow. Those are our pollinators. The soil is the diner itself. It provides the structure for the plants to grow. The cooks and the chefs are in the kitchen. They are making food. They're making plants to grow. So the cooks represent the plants in a meadow. Caterpillars and spiders, they represent the customers. They are eating all of the delicious plants and things that you find in a meadow. And our worms, millipedes, and slugs, those are our decomposers. So they represent the job played by the bussers in a diner. They are cleaning up after the meal is over. They're breaking down all of the waste and turning it back into soil and energy that can be used throughout the ecosystem. So next time you have a chance to go out to a diner or a restaurant, I want you to think about that ecosystem and how there are so many different roles that are played to make sure it functions properly. Perhaps one of the most important functions of a meadow is something that we are just learning more and more about. In fact, something we're not going to study today, but I can tell you about. Scientists are studying a meadow or a grassland's ability to capture and store carbon. That's right, meadows are amazing carbon sinks, and scientists are beginning to understand just how important these are for helping to protect us and eliminate the threat of climate change or reduce the threat of climate change. And we've known for a very long time that forests and trees can capture and store a lot of carbon. Reforesting areas is a really great way that we can reduce our impact on the earth and protect against climate change. But scientists have now started to be able to study the carbon that you see in a meadow. And carbon is in the soil, but they find large concentrations around the roots of these grasses that we see in a meadow, which is really amazing. And this has really cool implications for what we can do. In the United States, we have lots of areas where we once had native meadows, and we can now tell that by restoring some of those native meadows to biodiverse areas that are open space, we can actually help to reduce our carbon footprint and provide a place for carbon to be stored. But it is even better than that, because when we protect open space and when we create places for wildlife to live, we're also creating places for important species like our bees and our pollinators at the same time. So there's so many different benefits to creating meadows, to restoring meadows, or even to converting a portion of your own backyard into a meadow, into a wildflower meadow. Not to mention, it looks really beautiful as well.